Welcome to the Archaeological Sites Working Group. Obviously, we're not going to try and do any real work this time. I wanted to give everybody a chance to see where we got to in the two major projects that we have. And perhaps for people who are not used to the area, although I see some very familiar names coming up in the list of participants, just to give them a bit of background and history to a few things. So without further ado, I will start doing that process. So the first area we're going to look at is the new, well, it's new in that we haven't finished publishing it yet, the International Core Data Standard for Archaeological and Architectural Heritage. Now this is trying to address some very common errors that we see in documentation, archaeological documentation around the world. So we quite frequently see people mixing the archaeological thing with where it is. So we mix space and what we're looking at as being the same thing. And it really doesn't work very well. It's all right if you've got something like this example of Pretty Nine Barrows, where you've just got a mound of earth on top of a hill, we're good to go. But as soon as you start looking at more complex things, palimpsest landscapes, deeply stratified urban environments, complex sites which have evolved through time, then mixing space and what really breaks down very quickly and becomes almost impossible to use. We often see people mix people with their roles in events. So Wren becomes an architect from the moment he was born to the moment he dies, which of course is not really true. We see people mixing material with technique, so terms like turned wood, which is two completely different concepts, what it's made of and how it was made. So we need to separate those. We see people mixing periods with the type of object, with the type of archaeology that we're looking at. So the classic example is, you know, a thesauri entry for Roman fort. Well, they're two completely different concepts. One is about a social cultural phenomenon bounded in space and time, the Roman bit, and then fort is a type of site which has particular defensive qualities. And then we also see mixing of form and classification. So here we've got a castle, another type of military site, and it's in ruins, so that's the form. So again, people are taking two concepts and smashing them together and putting them into their documentation. And that makes it very difficult to unpack when you're trying to combine these data sets across national or regional boundaries. So that was the why we decided to tackle this problem. And the starting point was a colloque which was held in France, in Nantes, in 1992, which this is the title page from the proceedings, which eventually produced a standard called the Core Data Index to Historic Buildings and Monuments of the Architectural Heritage. I cannot find an extant copy of this to have a photograph of it, but that was it. It had a terribly bad data model inside it and was really just a list of fields. It didn't really have any concept of the types of things I was just talking about. So we decided we'd have a nudge at this back in 1993, as Irina was saying. But before that, there was other work. So there were other things that we wanted to deal with. So this was the original norm documentaire from CIDOC, which predated the start of our work, and which was the first standard I worked on in CIDOC, looking at this set of 12 fields with the full documentation for those 12 fields occupied a whole side of A4. It was massively complicated, the documentation of what should go into these fields. It was a terrible, the underspecified standard. So what we did was we built an international core data standard for archaeological sites and monuments, using the information from the Nantes colloque, but adding a decent data model and restricting ourselves to just dealing with archaeology rather than dealing with archaeology and architecture. And the data model we built was euphemistically known as the 4-box model. because it has 4 boxes on it. Really complicated reason for calling it that. So we have the archaeological items, top right, which allowed us to describe a particular piece of archaeology, whatever scale it was, whether that was a single eco-fact or an entire complex of religious habitation, for instance. But what we wanted to do is to be able to build up groups of those. So if we described the component parts of something, we wanted to be able to assemble them into something larger that we could say more stuff about. And that was the idea about having archaeological groups. So archaeological items can belong to multiple archaeological groups, and an archaeological group will consist of multiple items. And we've clearly separated the archaeology from where it is. So on the left, we have these physical spaces. So archaeological items occupy one or more physical spaces. Typically, they occupy more than one physical space because more modern intervention has broken them up into smaller pieces. So somebody's driven a road through the middle of your site, so the site's in 2 halves. So there are 2 physical spaces which have the archaeology of your villa in. And then when we start creating archaeological groups, we're going to have sets of physical spaces which represent the set of places where all of the component parts of the archaeological group exist. And so this was the simple 4-box model which allowed us to talk about that conceptualization. Now, there were other things going on at the same time. So Object ID came out as a drive to... Sorry? Right. Whoever's got their microphone on, and we're talking about chickpeas, might want to turn it off.
It might be, I think there's a drawer in there. Yeah.
Right. Object ID was created as a joint effort between the art world, the customs world, and the police world for the minimum set of information that was required for archaeological objects which had been stolen. So this was the stuff that would be used as the foundational template to move data about things that had been stolen and were being trafficked, so that they could be identified typically by customs officials and police forces, and eventually brought back into the to the owners. Object ID had 2 levels in it. There were the categories which you were required to record, and then there were a set of extra pieces called the recommended categories, which were the things which some people thought might be nice. And obviously, things like the object ID number fell into an area where professionals who were interested in the material wanted to know what its number was. It had been stolen from a museum, for instance, whereas the police force didn't care whose inventory number was attached to it. They just wanted a description so that Monsieur Policeman could say, that's the thing that's been stolen, I can return it to the correct person. So the recommended categories weren't compulsory, but could be added. Now, the reason I'm going to bring this up is that we decided that what we'd do is we would, in the 2nd edition, map all of the extra standards which were around, so the norm documentaire, the object ID categories, and the original standard, from the result of the Nantes colloque, so that we could show how you would represent the data from all of those that was formatted in all of those different standards and bring it into the CDS in the new edition. Now, as part of that, we also refined the data model to what's cunningly called the 5-box model. So we removed the relationship between physical groups and archaeological groups, because you can always imply that by going through the archaeological items to the physical spaces and thus to the physical groups. So it became the join between physical groups and archaeological groups was unnecessary. But we added in the concept of events. So this is archaeological events, so the observation of things happening, and they will allow us to see and interpret the archaeological items, and they will create the archaeological groups out of those individual items. So it's an act of interpretation to take some things that we see in the ground and say, well, actually, that's whatever it is. That's a monastery, as opposed to a fish pond and a wall and a bit of a church, right? So now we're talking about a monastery. Now, there's a special relationship between the first event, where we first spot the piece of archaeology, and the relationship between the archaeological item and where it is. Because obviously this is us discovering that thing and establishing that this archaeological item is in this physical space. So the first event, our discovery of archaeology, is actually related to this link between the archaeological item and the physical space. So that's quite an improvement on the original 4-box model, because now we're being explicit about the archaeologist's action in the process of producing record, and thus we can understand who said. So when we move on to this new standard, we end up with 10 areas, and I apologize here. The areas have renumbered as letters, and I haven't updated this slide. So they actually go from A through to J, J, rather than 1 to 10. And I apologize for that. I forgot to do this slide and update it. So there are these 10 areas. So names and references to other things, where it is, what type it is, any dating information we have for it, its physical condition, any protection status that has been assigned to it, free text or other descriptions. So you can put sound recordings or video recordings or other things in there if you want. Materials and techniques. So separating the materials from the techniques. So how was this thing, what techniques were used in the construction of it, and what materials were used in the construction of it. Any measurements have been made of it, and any persons and organizations which have had some involvement in the creation of or life history of the archaeological item or group. Now, so this closely follows the nonce colloques output, but there is a very important difference between the way we model stuff and the way that was originally modeled in the 1992 colloque. And that is, for us, an archaeological item can have one and only type. If your thing has multiple types, it's either multiple archaeological items or you're actually describing a group, and you should separate the things out that make the group up and assemble the group as a separate exercise. So you record the individual pieces and then say, I'm grouping these pieces together to make something with a higher explanatory power. And you use a different set of type criteria, a different set of thesauri terms to describe that agglomeration to what you would for the individual items. If you do that, then all of these horrible things that you see in databases of medieval farms built on top of Roman villas, so you get a Roman farm and a medieval villa, go away. And consequently, it's able to deal with the kinds of palimpsest landscapes and deeply stratified urban environments that are problematic if you smash those two concepts together, of space and time. So this is a very quick, and here I've got the letters properly, model of how those things relate to each other. This is in the standard, but you can see that it's there's the central group, and then there are various things tacked onto it, and you can only have one type. So that's why C, the type, is embedded in the item or group. We can't have multiple. It is one thing. If you've got more than one thing, then you have more than one archaeological item, and you should record them appropriately as individual elements.